The gunman expected fear, panic, maybe begging. What he got was a calm, "Sir, the register's already open," from a 68-year-old man who moved like he'd done this before, because he had, just on the other side of the badge. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden strength and quiet courage, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. The quick stop on Elm Street wasn't much to look at. Fluorescent lights that buzzed too loud, aisles barely wide enough for two people, and a coffee machine that hadn't worked properly since 2019. But it stayed open 24 hours, serving the night shift workers, insomniacs, and anyone else who needed milk or cigarettes when the rest of the world was sleeping. Frank Morrison had worked the graveyard shift for 3 years now. 68 years old, gray stubble, and reading glasses that he constantly adjusted while counting the register. Most customers saw him as just another old man trying to make ends meet, probably working because his pension wasn't enough. They weren't entirely wrong, but they weren't entirely right either. What they didn't see was how Frank's eyes tracked every customer from the moment they walked in, how he positioned himself so he could see both the front door and the back exit, how he kept his right hand free and his body angled toward the counter in a way that looked casual but wasn't. 25 years with Metro City SWAT had taught him that trouble usually came when you least expected it, and it always came fast. At 2:23 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, trouble walked through the front door. The man was young, maybe 25, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets, and he moved with the jerky, unpredictable energy of someone running on adrenaline and bad decisions. Frank watched him in the convex security mirror as the man pretended to browse the snack aisle. The kid kept glancing toward the counter, toward Frank, toward the register. His breathing was shallow, rapid. Classic pre-action stress indicators. Frank had seen it 1,000 times before. The man approached the counter empty-handed, his right hand still buried in his hoodie pocket. Frank set down his newspaper slowly, deliberately, and looked up with the kind of calm that only comes from having faced this exact scenario more times than you could count. "Help you with something?" Frank asked, his voice steady. The man's hand came out of his pocket, and with it a snub-nosed revolver that trembled slightly in his grip. "Open the register," he said, trying to sound tough but failing to hide the shake in his voice. "Now!" Frank didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't raise his hands or step back or do any of the things people do in movies. He just nodded once and said, "Sir, the register's already open." And it was. Frank had learned years ago to keep the register drawer slightly ajar during night shifts. It prevented damage to the mechanism if someone tried to force it, and it sent a clear message that he wasn't going to make this harder than it needed to be. But what the gunman didn't know was that Frank's left hand had already pressed the silent alarm button mounted under the counter, and his right hand was resting casually near the .38 he kept in a drawer that wasn't supposed to exist. "Take the money," the gunman said, waving the gun with the kind of wild gestures that come from watching too many movies and not enough real training. Frank reached for the register, moving slowly, deliberately. "How much you need?" he asked, as if they were discussing a loan rather than a robbery. The question caught the gunman off guard. "What?" "You heard me," Frank said, his voice still calm, still steady. "How much you need?" "Rent, drugs, medical bills, because there's about 200 in here, and if that's not enough to solve your problem, you're going about this the wrong way." The gun wavered in the man's hand. Just give me the money, old man." Frank started pulling bills from the register, but he didn't hand them over. Instead, he set them on the counter between them and said, "You know, 25 years ago I would have come through that door behind you, full gear, flashbang the works, would have had you face down before you knew what hit you." The gunman's eyes darted toward the door, then back to Frank. "What are you talking about?" "SWAT," Frank said simply. "Metro City. Retired 3 years ago." He gestured toward the money on the counter. "But I'm not that guy anymore. I'm just an old man working nights to pay for his wife's medications. So take what you need, but understand something. This isn't going to fix whatever's really wrong." For a moment the store was silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic on Elm Street. The gunman stared at Frank, at the money, at the old man who should have been terrified but wasn't. "You're lying," he said finally. Frank reached slowly into his shirt pocket and pulled out a wallet. From it, he extracted a small, worn piece of plastic, his retired SWAT ID card. He set it on the counter next to the money. The gunman leaned forward to look, and in that moment of distraction, Frank's training took over. 25 years of muscle memory condensed into 3 seconds of precise movement. Frank's right hand found the .38 in the drawer, while his left swept the gunman's weapon aside. Before the young man could react, he was looking down the barrel of a service revolver held by hands that had never once trembled in a crisis. "Now," Frank said, his voice still calm, but carrying a weight that hadn't been there before, "we're going to wait for my friends to arrive, and while we wait, you're going to tell me what's really going on, because nobody robs a convenience store at 2 a.m. unless they're desperate, and desperate people can usually be helped." The gunman's weapon clattered to the floor. His hands shot up, and for the first time since he'd walked in, his eyes showed something other than false bravado. They showed fear, yes, but also something else. Relief. My daughter," he stammered. "She needs surgery. Insurance won't cover it. I don't know what else to do." Frank kept the gun trained on him, but nodded toward one of the plastic chairs near the front window. "Sit down," he said. "Let's talk." 6 minutes later, 3 police cars pulled into the parking lot, their lights flashing, but sirens silent. The first officer through the door was Sergeant Martinez, a 15-year veteran who had worked with Frank back in the day. What he found wasn't what he expected. The gunman was sitting in a chair, his weapon on the counter next to Frank's ID card and a neat stack of $20 bills. Frank was behind the counter, pouring coffee from the machine that sort of worked, talking quietly to the man who had tried to rob him. "Frank?" Martinez said, his hand resting on his service weapon but not drawing it. "Everything okay here?" Frank looked up and nodded. "Tony Martinez," he said with a slight smile. "Still working nights, I see." "Frank Morrison," Martinez replied, understanding immediately. "Should have known. What's the situation?" "Young man here made a mistake," Frank said, handing a cup of coffee to the gunman, whose hands were no longer shaking. "But mistakes can be fixed. His daughter needs surgery. Know any lawyers who do pro bono insurance appeals?" Martinez looked from Frank to the gunman to the weapon on the counter, piecing together what must have happened. "Yeah," he said finally, "I know a guy." An hour later, after the paperwork was filed and the young father had been processed and released on his own recognizance, Martinez stayed behind to talk to Frank. "You could have called it in differently," he said. "Armed robbery, suspect subdued, would have been a lot more paperwork for him." Frank adjusted his reading glasses and went back to counting the register. "Could have," he agreed. "But 25 years taught me something about when to fight and when to listen. Kid wasn't a criminal. He was just a father out of options." Martinez nodded and headed for the door, then turned back. "Frank, next time you disarm someone, maybe call it in before you start playing therapist?" Frank chuckled. "Next time, bring better coffee. Mine tastes like motor oil." After Martinez left, Frank returned to his newspaper and his routine. The register was counted, the coffee was brewing, and the night stretched out ahead of him like it always did. But word spreads in a small city, especially among cops. By the next evening, Frank noticed changes. Officers started stopping by during their patrol routes, not for any official reason, just to grab a soda or check in. The young father called to thank him and let him know the lawyer Martinez recommended had taken his case. Frank never made a big deal about it. To him, it was just another night at work. He'd seen enough real danger to know the difference between a desperate father and a real threat, and he'd seen enough of life to know that sometimes the best way to stop a crime is to solve the problem that caused it. The teenagers who bought energy drinks at 2 a.m. still didn't know they were being protected by a ghost from SWAT's golden age. The insomniacs buying lottery tickets still didn't realize the old man behind the counter had spent decades keeping people like them safe. And Frank preferred it that way. Some people need to prove who they are, others just need to be who they've always been, even when nobody's watching. Frank Morrison had spent his career running toward danger when everyone else ran away. Now he spent his nights making sure the people who couldn't sleep felt safe enough to buy their milk and cigarettes without looking over their shoulders. Because that's what you do when you've sworn to protect and serve. The oath doesn't end when you turn in your badge. It just gets quieter. So the next time you see an older person working a job that seems beneath them, remember Frank Morrison. Remember that sometimes the people who look like they need protection are actually the ones providing it. And sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who doesn't look dangerous at all. Have you ever met someone like Frank? Someone whose quiet strength only showed when it mattered most? Share their story in the comments below. Let us know how they made you feel safer just by being there. Thank you for watching The Human Stories. If this story touched you, subscribe and share it with someone who believes in quiet heroes. Because the world needs more Frank Morrisons, people who choose to serve long after their service officially ends. Until next time, remember that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet voice at the end of the night saying, "Sir, the register's already open.